option of indigenous and minority language for fantasy and sci-fi world building only leads to more appropriation and misrepresentation of these cultures, or at best, a representation that is not even known. So even if you speak, for example, Swahili language in an Avatar movie, people don't know that it's Swahili language, they think it's Avatar language. We think that we support the counterfactual, whereby we want to see more regional specific movies, where if you want to represent these indigenous cultures, we make movies about these people in real life, right? So real life setting. An example of this is, for example, like Minari or Parasite in terms of Korean movies that has like recently won the Oscars. Such sort of movies for indigenous cultures, that is the counterfactual we propose. I'm going to be doing 3 things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about why this co-option of these languages in fantasy and sci-fi world is uniquely bad. I'm going to prove our counterfactual is a lot better, and I'm going to engage with the best case scenario and say even if we have best representation and appropriate representation, why it's so bad for these minority groups. Firstly, why this is bad? For a number of reasons. We need that sci-fi world building and fantasy building. Let's look at the characterization of these things. Oftentimes, sci-fi world building is a form of you're trying to create a world that is completely different from the current world we're in, right? That's why people often get the escapism that they see when they go into fantasy movies. Meaning that the kind of otherness that narrative you're creating is the use of indigenous culture is contributing factor in creating otherness, something that is different from us, right? So inherently, whenever we see the usage of these indigenous cultures and languages, we see the unique theme that is tied to it is the idea of foreignness, otherness, difference, right? We have that itself goes against the kind of representation that we want. Because if we get any kind of representation of these cultures, we rather like to see something more like, we're accepting of these people exist in our society. They exist, for example, minority communities in America, like immigrants, exist in certain ways, and that the kind of realistic portrayal is what we support, as opposed to a push of the foreignness and otherness that is created by these societies. So also secondly, if we look at sci-fi world building like Interstellar, Martian, or even things like Avatar and Harry Potter, like June, in terms of fantasy, we think the crucial way in which these movies operate is that they have a lot of dystopia in it. They have a world that is clashing, that is falling apart. They often have a villain. Oftentimes, these indigenous cultures, tribal languages are appropriated to those people who are often the villains, right? Because that, again, it contributes to the creation of foreignness and otherness, which means that we often see vilification of these languages and of these cultures when you're using it. This is especially more likely because at the point in which these fantasy and sci-fi world building movies are often created by American media, European media, those who have a lot of funding to create these movies, because fantasy movies and sci-fi building are often cost a lot of money because you need to do a lot of CG and stuff, right? Oftentimes the main language that is spoken within these movies are probably English, meaning that often it is the minor characters, it is the oppositional characters that often speak in these villain languages. At the very, very best, even if some sort of representation is good, we think that the airtime that these indigenous minority cultures get to be able to speak their language is also very, very small. Because in an American movie, if they speak Swahili for 2 hours, no one's going to really understand that, right? So oftentimes, the kind of dialogue in which they have is very, very small, meaning that each dialogue has a lot of impact in characterizing these characters, but often these dialogues themselves are probably not very nuanced in representing their culture or character building in the first place, because you can't add just that many subtitles, right? Often it really be some random quote on how they're going to kill the other person, and often that is a misrepresentation of these people. What do we have as a counterfactual? We would rather produce more regional specific movies that depict these indigenous cultures or create stories around it more in a realistic setting. An example of this is, for example, the portrayal of Minari, which is was a Korean movie about Korean Americans in America, or movies like Parasite, which represented the social inequality that exists in Korea, or Pachinko, which talks about the Japanese colonization of Korea, etc. Such kinds of movies have widely acclaimed, and we would rather support these more realistic movies that portray struggles of real people that actually exist in history. Why is this far more likely on our side? Firstly, because there's an increasing trend in actually wanting to see these movies. For example, Oscar recently added the award for international films, right? Meaning that there's actually a demand from not only big institutions, but also people to also see these movies. But also secondly, there's a more diverse platform in which these movies can be accessed. So if opposition comes in and talk about the only way for us to have indigenous representation is to put it in things like sci-fi movies and fantasy movies, we think that that's actually not true. Rising OTT programs like Netflix, or the fact that you can now post short films on YouTube for people to finally see, means that these diverse forms of movies that actually represent regional specific narratives and indigenous culture can be seen and widely be accessed, right? Finally, why is this also good in terms of representing why would the indigenous people and cultural people actually like this more than their counterfactual? Because at the point at which you actually make regional specific communities, movies, these indigenous people are actually able to advise and put their voices in movies. Whereas when you're trying to put your voice or your input in like a fantasy movie, what are you gonna put in, right? The fact that our language sounds like this, like that is the best at which you can go. Whereas on our side, your culture not only like one language, but your culture and your struggle can be embedded in the movies and the narratives in which it creates. Okay, this means that on our world, we have more directors, or actors, or people who are involved in the movie that are actually from indigenous people making these movies, whereas on their side, where fantasy movies, sci-fi world building is largely done by white, American, European people, are likely going to see cultural appropriation, especially because these indigenous people are of the minority. So we bite the bullet and say that maybe these movies are not going to be like in like absolutely like every cinema or every mega box in the world, but at least we get to see the rise of these films in things like Netflix or maybe in things like YouTube platforms, right? Where people will be able to see it. I think that that's a much better counterfactual. Finally, why even in their best case, where we already have good representation, why is it so bad? Because first of all, people are likely not going to know that this actually represents a certain type of indigenous culture. Oftentimes, these world building of sci-fi worlds not only like just talk about one indigenous culture, but they combine the cultures and languages of different indigenous tribes to make their world building. Meaning that we don't just get representation of one culture, but a mismatch. So when these people watch these movies, they don't really know the fact that they're looking at like an indigenous tribe in Australia, and that was the basis of it, right? Meaning that the very educational, I guess, level that they're trying to push is also very, very low. But even if, let's say that's all true, we need that, and let's say that their movies are not only good representative, but they represent well, and they inform people of a certain indigenous community, we think this is still bad, because it diverts the attention away from regional specific movies that actually portray the actual struggles. Because people are obviously inclined to watch things like fantasy and sci-fi movies because they have so much, interest, they're sparkly, they have a new world, I get to feel a sense of escapism, they have a huge dystopian plotline which tends to grab the attention of people, they have a lot of CG, right? So at the point at which people, they advertise these movies as being representative of indigenous culture, people are likely to see these sci-fi movies as opposed to regional specific movies, which means that it crowds out the kind of space that we have for regional movies to be actually aired. This is especially bad because again, we told you that no matter how representative sci-fi is, it is actually not a depiction of these real people's struggles in the real world. That is the kind of narrative that we want to see in media. At best, we might lose some attention on our films, but at least we have appropriate films that actually represent these people in a way that they want to be represented. In the worst case, we have reduced controversy because we are not likely to appropriate these people. And controversy is bad for these people because they currently lack the power to fight bad controversies because media platforms, because Netflix have a lot more money to kind of shut down these comments, whereas these minorities probably don't have the power to fight back and talk about how it is appropriated. For these reasons, we oppose regret outcomes.
Start off with my speech on the self-count of 3, 2, 1. Before I come to our positive, I want to talk about the counterfactual first. This is a retrospective debate. Everything which we talk about in terms of realistic movies being developed and being produced, all of those things happen on our side as well. You have all of these movies, plus you have fantasy movies as well. Every single benefit they talk about of all of them, like their counterfactual, is something we have on our side as well. It's completely symmetric. Second thing I want to talk about, note that the audience for fantasy as well as sci-fi is something which is quite different from what might be the audience for something which they are talking about in their counterfactual. Which is to say, the way a gamer is introduced to probably indigenous culture is probably through video games which are about indigenous culture. Someone who is interested in sci-fi is introduced to all of these cultures because they are just interested in sci-fi and now they have co-opted these cultures within sci-fi. So we think we give more exposure to all of the different audiences uniquely on our side, which gets completely removed on their side. But I want to talk about this cooption first, and what does this cooption of minority and indigenous languages, art and culture in fantasy and world building look like, right? First, Where exactly is it shown? We think that this is shown across arts and media literally everywhere. So movies, TV shows, books, short films, video games, etc. It's shown everywhere. The key thing about this is that all of these things cumulatively have a huge and a wide audience which expands across billions and billions of people. Second thing I want to talk about is how exactly is this representation shown. First, this looks like incorporation of various languages in terms of synthetics, languages, etc. being used, which is of indigenous people, in terms of their phrases, words, catchphrases, etc. being used. Note what Affirmative talks about is only the villain is shown with these specific features, etc. Note that that's completely untrue. In Black Panther, the literally main characters, etc., the whole world, the positive character who brings about the change, all of these people are shown from these indigenous areas as well. It's completely untrue that only the villain is shown, and I'm going to talk about how this representation is going to be done in good ways, which is going to deal with the fact that just the villain is shown as a foreign actor is something which is untrue. Secondarily, we think this looks like the co-option of the mythology and history of the indigenous and minority individuals within these areas or within these spheres of art. This looks like showing people from their race, the color, the food they eat, how the society and environment goes ahead and operates, the geographical similarities in terms of, for example, what might happen in Korea and incorporate that in video game and world building, the landscape of these cities, etc. Right? But thirdly, we think there is also a huge amount of religious as well as incorporation of the deities of these indigenous and minorities. This looks like Vishnu, Krishna, etc. actually being shown in all of these art forms, right? But fourthly, we think you show a lot of customs, traditions, etc. as well. So for example, touching feet of people as an outcome of respect, all of these things are also incorporated. But fifthly and most importantly, we think that the incorporation of their culture into technology and science, etc. is something which takes place. So if you want to go ahead and talk about some mythological creature or some sort of like high technology, AI, etc. within these video games, you show them speaking the particular languages, dressed in their cultures, etc. Note, the reason why all of this is important is because of two reasons. First, note, for example, a video game spans literally across 4,000 hours of gameplay. Movies literally are really long. You have TV shows which span across like 15 to 20 episodes. The reason why this is important is because the depiction of all of these individuals is something which can be shown in a quite complex and nuanced manner, which consists of lots of details as an outcome of the fact that you have the capacity to show all of these, as an outcome of the fact that you have a lot of time to depict all of these details. Further, secondarily, for you to actually show their culture, tradition, etc., you cannot just like start off from like a blank point, which is to say you need to hire individuals who belong to these cultures, communities, etc., so that you can actually have depiction which is true, accurate. I'll talk about why you get that. But to have depiction which is true and accurate to nature, you need to do things like research. You need to go ahead and have writers who belong to these communities so that they can go ahead and write the most accurate dialogue, which is something which is relatable to the community, etc. at large. We think all of these things become important and these lead to some sort of employment for these people from these communities, which they lose out on the comparative. Then, I want to go ahead and talk about why exactly is this entertainment important. We think the escapism they talk about is something which is crucial within this debate as an outcome of the fact that the lives of individuals from these minority communities, etc. is something which is bad in status quo in terms of discrimination, microaggression, etc. So any sort of hope and aspirational value they go ahead and get in terms of escapism is just a net good. Now I want to talk about why exactly would this co-option be done in good ways, and we have multiple reasons for this. First, we think creator, producers, etc. of all of these arts, insofar as they want to maximize profit, they can go ahead and do that through various ways. This looks like getting good interviews for whatever they've produced, positive reviews, etc. All of this encourages individuals and drives individuals to buy that particular gameplay or particular movie more. The way they can go ahead and do that is by actually getting that positive feedback loop from the general masses at large. We think the word in this context is important. It's becoming more and more liberal day by day, whereas you have call-outs for corporations, etc., who are doing things which are like bad in nature, etc. The point I'm trying to get to is that general audience is going to go ahead and provide you with a lot of backlash. If you go ahead and do things like appropriation, people are and celebrities are called out every day for appropriating. They lose millions and millions of followers, etc. We think the fallout is really strong. But secondarily, we think you also just get lots of fallout from the community in particular they are showing in that particular art for being insensitive, inaccurate or appropriating, etc. And secondarily, we think these conversations blow up really quickly because if you see a review from someone from that community literally calling it something which is like inappropriate or insensitive or how they've appropriated their art, this leads to a lot of empathy and sympathy generation in the minds of audience where they feel bad and they want to help the people from that community. Also secondarily, we think that the word in and of itself at all points in time, mass audience also wants to support the mass accuracy which goes ahead and takes place, and these videos end up gaining a lot of traction as an outcome of that. This goes ahead and leads to an even more intense backlash for these people and producers, etc., which again drives away their profits. But also note, and thirdly, in secondary conversation and communication which takes place, once a game, etc., is out, there's an, for example, a TV show is out. It's released in parts. So you have 7 episodes which are released in like maybe January, 7 episodes are released in July, or like video games, etc., also have continuations, small video games, etc. All of these interviews, interactions lead to things like reviews on YouTube, fan-based communities continuously talking about it. All of these conversations just compound with time. All of this literally goes ahead and acts as community-like discussion, which can lead to huge call-out and check mechanism from all of these individuals. But most importantly, note, individuals and viewers also go ahead and have incentive to, creators have incentive to make these games in ways which show differences in views which are quite unique in nature, because they know a creator is going to get awards and rewarded when the video game is going to be recognized by the general public more, not for being the 7th video game which is available in the market, but probably for being something which is quite unique, for quite different, for creating curiosity, etc. So they have an incentive to go ahead and actually talk about the nuances which are quite different in nature for all of these communities to create that curiosity. But lastly, we think that the storylines, etc., just become more entertaining as an outcome of showing these nuances. So even if on their side the creator is the most evil person who doesn't want to show these nuances, what happens is that you end up showing different backgrounds, you show nuances, details in a way which go ahead and make it more connected to the audience, you make it more engaging to the audience, and this just makes the gameplay experience or just the experience of consuming this art much more better. All of these reasons just conclude that you have as the creator reasons to produce this art in good ways, which is not going to be something which is going to be appropriated at large, which is why you get the net benefit of having more accurate art on our side. Proud to negate.
The main question I hear from the first negative speaker is that this representation is necessarily good. Even if I buy that to the fullest extent, good intentions doesn't necessarily mean an accurate depiction. It doesn't necessarily mean that that depiction is going to be well understood by people who consume that entertainment, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be well received. What we're going to tell you is that all of these things are going to be done badly, and therefore poorly understood and poorly received by the public, which creates a worse narrative for these indigenous peoples and their cultures, right? Because ultimately, the media they support is entertainment, and it's meant to entertain people, not educate them. I probably think that I don't want to be educated while I'm playing my video game after having 6 hours of classes on a Monday, right? I probably think that's something I would rather not do, and instead gravitate towards a game that I find extremely entertaining to me and has good narrative and story building, which probably doesn't happen under your side of the house, even if they do a good job at accurately representing these things. 3 direct parts we're going to talk about. First thing I want to say here is that fantasy and sci-fi probably requires English as the language of medium at most times, because most viewers or players who are going to speak English, and movies and games are most likely made for profit, right? So especially fantasy and sci-fi movies, because they're typically blockbuster type movies. They have very large budgets, or blockbuster games. They have very large budgets, and they probably want to make a return on that. So they'll probably cater to the largest possible audience, which is going to be people who speak English as a main primary language, right? And this means that the main characters, and typically protagonists and heroes, also speak English within this narrative. So what you get on their side is that the culture and language is pushed to the side from the get-go, or are depicted as villains for storytelling purposes, which is obviously bad because it paints these cultures in a negative light, even if it's depicted with good faith and done accurately, right? I still think we have the onus to say that these people are probably going to be presented as bad people in these narratives, right? Instead, movies and literature can also just create languages that are actually meant to push the storytelling narrative. So like Elvish in Lord of the Rings, for example, or Klingon in Star Trek. And in this specific way, we probably say you remove the risk of controversy for movies and games, so it's probably better for the industry. But more importantly, you remove the possibility of villainizing minority cultures and languages, which is a possibility that will always exist on their side of the house. And that's extremely harmful, because as soon as one game or one movie doesn't do this well, there's probably going to be a large amount of backlash that they aren't able to contend with, right? even if cultural uses are well done, you then don't get much public attention either, right? Because it requires more use of those cultures and those languages, at which point you subvert the expectations of the public on that piece of entertainment, right? Because it's US-centric, so you expect an English type of entertainment, so an English game or an English movie that's centered around the English language, right? The ad campaigns need to be vastly different to typical types of entertainment, right? So you have to actually cater and explain to these people that that this game or this movie is going to actually center around this specific type of culture or language, right? And what that leads to is that you don't get much attention towards this game anyways, because consumers are likely going to gravitate towards things that are more suited to them, which means you don't get much attention on these languages and cultures, even if they do that well. The best case then on their side of the house is that it doesn't create much interest anyways, so I don't really understand what exactly the delta is on negative, right? Because even their best case, things like Black Panther, for example, which received a lot of attention, I would argue your thoughts coming out of that movie was, oh wow, Wakanda, what a beautiful place, right? It's probably not, I wonder what it actually looks like, because I don't think Wakanda is an accurate representation of just some random African country, right? It's probably something that's fictionalized, and people so people still don't actually understand what that culture means, and they're probably not necessarily likely to look deeper into that culture, because the main reason for watching that movie is something that they find entertaining to them, right? Secondly, then, on the point of cultural appropriation, you probably have a lot of cultural appropriation in these types of entertainment, right? Because it's probably made by Americans because of Hollywood, right? Meaning to make an accurate depiction requires a lot of work. And we tell you this research probably won't be done for two reasons, right? First is that the movies make most of their box office or most of their profits in the US. And because they're profit driven, they don't see the need to, right? Because hiring all of these people to make accurate depictions also costs money, right? And necessarily, even if you're making a movie with a big budget, you still need to budget it in a certain way because you have very high costs, right? You have things like CGI, A-list actors, meaning the people in control of the movies are part of the institution of Hollywood, and they probably also want to push and cater towards the majority group, and they probably don't necessarily feel the need to spend extra money on things like advisors, for example, to make good cultural representations, especially if that cultural representation is going to be a minor part of that movie in its narrative, right? And that has just historically been the case. Even if they tell you then that they will hire specific people of those communities, I'm not sure why this is likely true, but I'll buy this to the fullest extent anyways. Why is that still unlikely to happen? 4 responses here. First, minorities probably don't have much power to protest. So even in the event that you create these games or you create these movies and they're poorly received by these minorities, there's not necessarily any leeway for them to protest against the viewing of these movies, because the main thing you need is for the majority of the people to accept this movie or to accept this game as it is, which is a piece of entertainment, and likely in the vast majority of cases where they're trying to market these products, that is going to be the case because the majority of your consumers are going to be white or part of the majority group, right? Especially if you're marketing in the US, for example. Second, the use of these cultures is typically used for a narrative within that world building, right? So the culture needs to fit into the game or movie, not the other way around, right? How do you build a game or a movie? I would argue the first thing you do is probably you build that story and then you fill the pieces around it rather than building the cultures of that specific game or that specific movie and then building the story around that world, right? Thirdly, you can easily scapegoat responsibility by just calling it fiction and therefore not assuming responsibility for the bad representation that you're doing, because ultimately, fantasy or sci-fi is not meant to accurately represent human life, for example, so you don't necessarily need to take responsibility anyways, even if there is backlash on their side in these scenarios, right? Meaning you're unlikely to hire these specified people that are able to create good representation, right? What we tell you as the alternative is that we just generally have more regional representation now, which is increasingly happening. What we tell you there is that there's already increased attention towards international movies. Think of Parasite, which won the Oscars, a new dedicated Oscar for international pictures, for example, and movies like Minari, for example, which are made in the US but by people of that culture who speak that language, meaning the representation is directly better and directly represents the lives of those people, right? There's 3 unique benefits here. The first is that viewers actually see the direct representation of these minority groups because the people that are pictured speak the language and do specific things and those people are people from that group, right? Which we tell you is important because people will come away with thoughts about what they just watched. Like I told you, if it's Black Panther, they probably come away with like, oh, what an awesome action movie. But if you actually portray the lives of these people, that's probably what people will think about, and that's part of that culture, right? Second, the people who make these movies are from that group, so not only is representation of culture done better within these types of entertainment, but we also create a way for minority groups to break into the world of filmmaking or game making and acting, meaning that's probably a better longevity of these cultures within cinema because they're represented in the people who make them, right? And third, you don't get crowded out by mainstream movies who show indigenous cultures, and I want to note is extremely harmful on their side because consumers are far more used to US centric movies and entertainment, meaning they gravitate towards that, which means that movies that actually accurately represent these groups are left out by the wayside, right? Why do we still get a lot of attention on our side of the house then? Notice that a lot of these popular international movies take a while to become popular. So they debut at film festivals like Sundance, and then they get good reviews, meaning that people want to go and watch them. And the people then know what type of movie they're walking into, and they actually want to go in and watch it for that specific reason. So to understand that culture, which we tell you is probably a better way of doing this, rather than on their side where they just want to watch it because they're going to think that that movie is entertaining for those reasons. So far.
Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I strategically want to point out why side affirmative has a wrong problem solution managed. Because the point is, we agree, these movies are not for accuracy or to show you the best thing in the world. They're separate audiences for documentary. But what we have to crucially know is that we don't have to justify a world where documentaries don't exist because we defend status quo. In status quo, they're right. There are Oscars for documentaries and they're probably becoming popular in front of a niche audience who likes those stories and likes to watch authentic viewership around documentaries and authentic stories. But there are also large amounts of audiences who watch Marvel, for example, who want to see diversity within the viewership across the mainstream. Because mainstream is what enters social circles and has a larger impact on one of the most important groups, which is the kids. Because note this, as a 10-year-old kid, when I'm in my friend circle who says their favorite superhero is Superman, I can't say, watch this documentary about my context about my life, because nobody gives a shit. I can probably say right now that my favorite superhero is Shang-Chi, and at least have some sort of representation and aspiration to be like Shang-Chi or at least relate to Shang-Chi, or have my favorite superhero in my favorite idea like Marvel. So the point is, these are two very different audiences, which is why I think the counterfactual is symmetrically applicable to our world, and I don't think solves any of the issues which they say because we can just simply co-opt it. So strategically they're already up. But then I go to detailed responses. Firstly, they say movies are about dystopias, so you're probably only going to show villain around these things. Two responses. One, that's just false, because you can just gut check with Shang-Chi, the superhero who saved the life of all individuals. He was shown as the main hero, and you showed customs of Shang-Chi. You showed when he comes back, he goes ahead and has a religious thing with his family before he goes ahead and kills the goons and all those things. Which means you show background of these customs in all these arcs of these main superheroes. So I don't think it's villain. But in the best case, even if it is villain, show there are some villains who have background of some Asian characters, but there are also superheroes. But the comparative on their world looks like no representation at all. You don't have people from these backgrounds coming into the mainstream industry at all. When there's a comparative, which is much worse for individuals, because then you have no representation or diversity versus some representation, even in some cases if it's a villain. But secondly, they say people have no idea about what is being shown, they just see it as a good action movie. That's false on two levels. The first, when directors show diversity within their movies, they can't stop boasting about it. This is just intuitively true. When a director has a diverse cast, you know what the first thing which he says in the review of the movie or when he talks about the movie? I have a very diverse cast. We've cast people from 7 different ethnicities. Because that's a very good differentiating point for the director and producer to gain the most amount of viewership. So people end up knowing a lot about it. But secondly, people are getting liberal. So for an Asian character, if you start hiring a white individual, people are going to be fucking pissed about it. They're going to call the director out on that. This has recently happened when you see Disney going way too authentic or opposite from old classic movies or something. People do call this out because they're engaged with all of this. They do care about what the mainstream is necessarily showing. And if you want to talk about the effectivity of this, I think producers care about money, right? So if they lose viewership because of these exclusive reasons, they're probably bound to change. Which means at any point in time, people are going to have knowledge upon this. But secondly, I think people at least have some base level knowledge. Which means if I see an Asian character, the first thought which enters my mind is sure we have Asian superheroes as well as the entire story. So I think in the worst case scenario, if you don't learn anything, you at least have some sort of diversity on screen, which is really enough to delta and explain why that's the case, which is important for the most important viewers. But third, they say good intention does not mean it's well received because this is meant for entertainment and not accuracy and stuff. That's a very important line. That's I think fair. But if I explain to you why we don't need to win the accuracy clash exclusively with this mechanism, I think this push is already out. But why is it further important? We think the impact of this debate is that as long as you show diverse characters having very diverse character arcs, you're able to cater to a larger audience. You're able to cater to like teenagers, because there are people who read books. You're able to cater to kids who watch movies, which means the impact we have is much greater and much diverse than simple documentaries who probably very niche audience watches. Which means in the worst case, even if we overshadow these documentaries, at some point in time I'm ready to take a trade-off simply because the scale is too big on our side versus the niche people who are probably going to end up watching and researching about these areas regardless. Which means just on scale, I think we impact a lot more people in a more intense manner because the representation is so diverse and I can relate to these characters a lot more. Then they say that Wakanda is not an accurate description, that like that's the only thing I come about as a very good action movie. I think that's a fair metric. As long as I see black actors in that movie screen, as an individual from that community, I have somebody within this stream to go and look forward to. I can relate to the character, I can even not to the character, I relate to the actor. These are people who are getting opportunities to work in certain movies. What is the alternative for these actors? This is very crucial. Their case is, you will not hire actors from these stories or whatever. But if we are right, if it's about world building, you will probably have to be very accurate because you're spending like 7 episodes setting a show up. Like Shogun on Disney Hotstar, right? It literally has 7 episodes setting the world up before anything happens in the show. Which means if you have more time, you probably have more accountability to go into details of things. And this is just intuitive. When you have to go into details of things in context, you largely have to take about relevance, do your research to be accurate if you want to make it the most entertaining thing out there. Which means for accuracy, I'll have to cast Japanese characters for that. I'll have to cast like Asian people who play these roles. Which means at all points of time, comparatively achieve a larger amount of people and actors who get opportunities on our side versus there. This is a net benefit to win the debate regardless, because I think without media narrative supporting these like Marvel movies like Shang-Chi, etc., there's no incentive for directors to diversify the actors and give these people opportunity. Which means the comparative does look like you're having less people from these diverse backgrounds and having no people to look up to as future actors or just kids. I'm going to now impact this debate very simply in terms of why all of this is relevant and why is relatability something which is very important. Relatability happens on 2 levels. First, on friend circles. This is just very true in terms of kids going around for teenagers, right? The first thing you do when you go and like watch a very entertaining series or a book, you discuss it on social media. You discuss it within your friends. There are literally fantasy discussion groups on social media. I'm not part of them, but they surely exist. They go and break down movies and explain why the character did X thing or Y thing. In these social circles, the first thing which happens to a child who's from a like background, for example, Asian like me, is that I relate very hard with this particular character who didn't exist before that. Like I always felt like my customs are always in the minority. I didn't have like some amount of self-imaging to say that I can be a part of the majority thing. I always assumed that an actor, if he has to be a superhero, probably has to be like very strong and white in color. I did never imagine that an Asian background person can actually go there. Which means now when I see Shang-Chi, when I see Black Panther, in these social circles, I feel confident talking about my background because I have some mainstream relevance, like related points of reference which I can give. Like, you know what, watch this. This is a person from my community, this is a good action movie to watch. Which means even at worst, if it's just an action movie, it still acts as a point of reference for people to go and use and act in social circles. But secondly, a lot of minority people see culture as a part of their self-identity. Right now, they face a lot of issues, which is why they're not very confident about this identity. They don't think it can be part of the mainstream community or the mainstream ideology. We think when you make movies around these ideologies, this self-imaging about your own culture gives the opportunity to feel people to feel better about their culture. To probably talk in social circles about with more freedom about where they belong from, what country they come from, why their customs are not very weird. And even customs like touching their feet is something that is so intrinsic in our Asian culture. But when you do it in any other country, it's taken in a very weird way until unless probably a mainstream movie shows that custom. Now, it's not seen as something that is so irrelevant or so stupid to do because you understand that you know what, people do it at a vast nature. These are the points of references within the customs which help your self-imaging issues to a vast degree and acts as points of references for you to feel much better about this. The impact of this is magnanimous in this debate because kids who watch these movies are probably the most important stakeholder in this debate. Because they are the biggest audiences of these mainstream ideology like readers, books or whatever it is, right? Which means if the comparative, this is where I want to have a clear distinction. They have to defend the world without the existence of these movies having including anything like this at all. Which means you're probably going to push more and more only one ethnicity superheroes coming into play and no points of reference to be acted for the individuals. Which means one, diversity reduces massively because the incentive of directors to like have people from these diverse like backgrounds goes away. But second, points of references continue to decrease. But lastly, insofar as they have no exclusive mechanism to prove why their counterfactual solves any of those problems rather than creating more problems because of lack of diversity, I think they're strategically already behind because you've already cemented the best of the counterfactual because there's a different audience for documentaries and a different audience for mainstream media on that route to
checks and balances mechanism upon what we the negative is pushing for. The biggest analytical really big hole what we see in the negative side is that they suddenly try to say that sci-fi and fantasy movies are the only form that minority actors can perform it, or maybe the people can attach those kind of things with like existence, right? Because in 8 minutes of the second negative speech can be just simply said that there are different movies, there are different genres of movies and video games. If we see games like Civilization, which is not a sci-fi or a fantasy movies, but there are characters and there are actors that can perform in a movie, then as like a, I don't know, an Asian kid you can align upon Sejong, King Sejong inside those kind of video games. Of course there will be still minority actors and minority representatives and figures performing in such medium. We already talked about that. This debate is not about whether we have Shang-Chi or not, or whether those kind of particular genres of movie called sci-fi or called fantasy is creating a positive medium to such minority representation. What we're telling you is the unique characteristics of such medium is that they create these identities of individuals is simply a tool for building up their world. And we already talked about a lot of cases about why this should fit the majority's case, but we will also extend to in my second class about why this is possible. So therefore, the whole 8 minutes of the previous speaker talking about like you will not have Shang-Chi doesn't really mean anything because there will be still minority representatives. So let's first talk about the cultural exposure point. I have four responses for that cultural exposure. The first fundamental one is that they never prove why that cultural exposure is good, except for you have Shang-Chi point, right? Because if the only benefit that they take is that the minorities now have a figure or an individual that can rely upon, we don't think that that's the mutually exclusive benefit that they take. And if the point is that just like we have a Chinese game, we're pretty unsure why that's beneficial. Because what we're pushing in the affirmative is that because your representation that you put in such games are something that is largely discordant, or in some cases maybe validified inside the cases, then people will simply find your characters inside your fantasy movies as something that is representing your community, like you have described. Now people will think that people from Black Africa should be represented by Black Panther and Wakanda, which is a lot of cases of big misunderstanding and misrepresentation of those kind of individuals having in the case. The unique problem of this is that the second point that we say is that they cannot just run away by saying that we still have Parasite and Milan, because our first affirmative already preempted that by saying that the impact that these fantasy and sci-fi movies create is that this crowds out attention from such movies already existing. Why is this? They themselves, their first speaker character is that these audiences are totally different. Like this person is only interested in sci-fi. I'm pretty unsure if that is true, because we think that these kind of interest trickles down. If these kind of sci-fi movies didn't exist, we think that these people that want to find out such fun movies will look at Parasite, which won an Oscar as well. But if that's true, that these audiences are just totally different groups of people, what we are pushing for is that they will just simply see Shang-Chi, think that that's the Chinese culture, and never look for like further education or acknowledgement or anything that they are pushing as their most important checks and balances mechanism. No further development will happen, where there will be even less interest in movies that more accurately represent such culture, because like you said, it is the easiest way that the individuals can see those kind of movies, which they can so easily believe, because understanding Chinese culture is much harder than you saying that Shang-Chi is the only case that we can align upon, right? So we say that even if we say that this cultural exposure is somehow beneficial, you cannot run away by saying that you still have Parasite. You're taking away the space and taking away the investment that such movies should receive towards such movies that are just a Hollywood blockbuster that no one will even know if that character is Korean. 3, we say that at best, what they say about like validation of individuals better done in our side. Why is this? Let's say that there are same directors that they characterize as is very interested in drawing such culture, because their main mechanism is that because these directors have a lot of time explaining about the world comparison, they are very interested in such culture as a build up such like those kind of cultures. In that case, then what will those kind of directors create in our world, right? You don't create sci-fi and you believe that those kind of directors are not being, because we're regarding their world, there will be much lesser fantasy and sci-fi movies that are directed to their side, right? Then these kind of directors or actors that you talk about will participate and create movies that have a better cultural appropriation, because we're saying that creating a totally new world medium is the worst way to represent such culture, because in a lot of cases you don't even recognize that that is the culture that exists. Even if it is, I don't know, like an action movie, you know that that actor is is living in a Chinese, some kind of gang organization. While when you are drawing this as a Shang-Chi, you don't see, the only thing that you see about that guy is he is Chinese and he, like, I don't know, Manchu, and he has a superpower, right? We say that that's the worst way that you can possibly impose a culture to an individual. Their money is not to prove that exposure exists. They should prove what is the unique value that sci-fi and fantasy movies give. They never do that. So what's the way here? Even if we fight out everything and we say that we give up some attention, that this audience group that is very selective to watching sci-fi now escapes from this field. We say that we are welcome to trade those kind of attention to things like better cultural accuracy because of two reasons. One, we already proved why their best case doesn't manifest. It's not that individuals no longer have a person or figure to elect with. There are still medium for the minority opinion to gain attention. And our first and second speaker already built it up why there are movies and growing interest in such kind of minority medium. It doesn't need to be fantasy, right? And two, the accuracy that we are talking about itself is the people that are hurt most is the people that are living in a vulnerable condition. If you're a Korean American inside the United States, and then when somebody asks you, like, where are you from? We say that those kind of problems itself is the people that are hurt by such misrepresentation are the most vulnerable people inside this ghetto. So if that's the case, then we gain less Hollywood movies in order for those people's safety and those people's rights. We're welcome to take this trade-off. Secondly, let's talk about this checks and balances mechanism. I have 4 responses to this kind of checks and balances mechanism. One, they say that, oh, people do not want criticism, so they will, I don't know, don't do cultural appropriation. The unique characteristics of sci-fi and fantasy video games, for example, is that it is so easy to justify such alteration of culture, right? When you see like movies like Big Hero, no one thinks that it is, I don't know, racially discriminatory to have an Asian character being a scientist. If you see a lot of video games with maybe Asian mythology, even if that Asian character speaks English, and even if none of the Koreans can understand what the Korean guy in Black Panther is talking about, no one thinks that that is severely problematic, because it is a very easy justification to say that this is a fantasy movie, right? This is a fiction movie, which in cases of non-fiction or other genres of movie, or the movies that we perpetuate as something that is beneficial, that is taken away by the interest that they are perpetuating, we said that those kind of things itself has much lesser ground for justification. So that's why the first speaker's negative pushing for, oh, these kind of individuals being like criticized are in most cases not done in fiction in these cases. Secondly, we can flip those kind of mechanisms and say that because they do not want criticism, these video games or movies are very much like shaped towards majority's taste, right? So they are trying to create this movie in a way that majority will accept themselves as something that could be popular, right? For example, Black Panther characters speak English. Someone will remember there was a Korean woman from Black Panther, and she doesn't even speak Korean. None of the ones can understand those kind of things. The reason for those kind of things is because the majority is simply uninterested inside a fiction movie upon what those kind of things people are caring about. The comparative here is that if you're going to watch Parasite, which is a Korean culture movie, the audience and the individuals are already interested in such matters and are going to watch those kind of things and expecting those things. Therefore, their mere exposure to checks and balances do not work in the first place. The way here, therefore, is that the only mechanism that they have is like, well, there's like a bunch of time that we can use. We say that directors and gaming always want to minimize the boring stuff. In a lot of cases, sci-fi and fiction creates things that these kind of identity tools are something that is boring. They try to minimize this by only putting the image. And we say that that's clearly negative.
My name is Dhruv, prefer to pronounce /him. Starting my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. Just a couple of extraneous rebuttals, then I'll start being this way. Firstly, we still have minority characters and representation in our side of the world. It's not about having minority characters, it's about having representation in certain situations which is valuable to these minorities in the first place to begin with. Which is to say, if I'm from a minority community, I already see a lot of suffering in my daily life. My proximate experiences are bad because I'm discriminated against. I come from a poor environment, which is to say aspiration and escapism is the most important form of this catharsis for me, because that is something that makes me feel heard. That is something that provides me that hope that I need in my life, and that's the most important thing within this debate. The point is that we will make these realistic movies. We don't think we need more realistic movies because minorities suffer in their real life. What they need is escapism and hope, because they don't want their real circumstances to be shown in movies. What they want to feel is hope. What they want to feel is better about the future that they have, and that is what we are trying to achieve in our side of the world, and is really important within this debate in the first place. Secondly, crowding out happens, crowding out is bad. We have a couple of responses to that. Number one, we think even in status quo movies like Parasite and realistic movies still have gotten attention because you still just have different audiences for these movies in the first place to begin with. But secondarily, I take the worst case scenario. Even if this is true, even if crowding out happens, why is that bad? We think it's good because it reveals the revealed preferences of these people. Because if they are agreeing that people watch more escapism movies when they are actually present, that means that escapism is more important for these people, that they are willing to take the trade-off of realistic movies. So empirically what they have shown is that escapism is a more fundamental need for humans rather than being shown reality. So if it's the preference of these people, I don't understand why it's even wrong in the first place to begin with. But thirdly, and this is where the comparative is very, very flimsy, we'll have these directors making realistic movies. Who are these directors? Why will they make realistic movies? We think the more realistic comparative that exists in their side of the world is that fantasy movies are still made, but they are more Eurocentric in nature. They are more majority dominated, which also means that they also isolate the minorities and the indigenous communities because they cannot relate to those movies in the first place to begin with. This is important because they just assume you get more realistic movies. Why does that happen? What's the likelihood analysis of that? We think what's likely to happen is you get more fantasy movies without the indigenous communities because they have also said that it's more in demand in the first place to begin with. Just some more remarks, and then I'll start bringing this debate in general in the first place. I think we have a lot of analysis to prove why it's likely to be done in a good way. Firstly, when you make certain diverse movies, the communities also become your major fan bases in the first places to begin with. This is important because when Black Panther was released, it wasn't just watched by white-dominated or white majority individuals. A lot of African Americans actually went and watched that movie. Insofar as that is true, these communities become a part of your fan club. At that point of time, you need to care about their revealed preferences because they also form a major block of money that you earn because they actually buy those tickets, they buy your merches because they become your fans. So you need to care about their preferences because this is how you can earn money in the first place to begin with. But secondarily, why showing nuances helps you earn more money in general? We think showing nuances makes you feel more authentic. If I'm a director, I want to show nuances in general because it makes the movie better and more entertaining. Even if people just don't care about it, I'm going to include these nuances because it just makes it seem more authentic for people to buy into in the first place to begin with. But thirdly, we have already talked about call-outs, we have already talked about the fact that backlash can exist. And if they concede that these movies are majorly made in America, we think America is very, very diverse in terms of the cultural background that they have, in terms of the independent journalism that exists there in the first place to begin with. And the major question that I want to ask within this speech, why is accuracy the major metric to judge this debate? I'm really, really unsure, and this is really, really important in this debate. Their point is, if I watch a Shang-Chi movie which is culturally appropriated, I start hating on the Chinese people. I think that's fundamentally false. Why? Because the expectations that I have when I'm watching a fictional movie are different from when I'm watching a realistic documentary in the first place. So if I'm a majority-dominated white person, I know that I'm watching a fictional movie, I'm watching a fantasy movie. So I never correlate these differences with that is how they act, because I know that fictional movies tend to have things which are inaccurate. So when I'm entering these movies, I'm not entering with the fact that they have to be accurate, because fantasy movies just aren't accurate. So the entry point of people within these movies isn't that they want accuracy, they want hope and entertainment. So we are willing to take the trade-off of some cultural appropriateness happening, because if it means that people actually feel better about themselves, we think that's in general also really, really important. But secondarily, and this is also important, we think you as a minority are okay with being appropriated to a little degree within this regard. Why? This is simple. Because if I'm watching a fantasy movie, if I'm watching a fictional movie, I also manage my expectations within that regard. I know it's not going to be perfect. I know all nuances can't be accommodated in a fictional movie. If a documentary was being made, I would be pissed, I would be very angry. But if I'm a minority, I'm not pissed, I'm not sad. Because I expect appropriation to happen because that's the nature of fictionality in the first place to begin with. And that takes out their best case scenario, that even if some fictionality and some appropriateness is present, we think that's still fine in the first place. What is our case and why is it the most important thing? Do you need accuracy to feel heard? Do you need accuracy to feel hope. We don't think that's true. Why? Because as a child, when you're watching a movie, you don't care about nuances. You don't care about your customs and traditions being shown in a correct manner. You're just happy that someone from the same ethnicity is getting to be a superhero, is getting represented. That's where the happiness comes from. That's where the feeling of catharsis comes from. Notice that this is more certain in our side of the world. The benefits are speculative because their comparative is something which is really, really unclear. And so whereas some kids feel happy because they are able to relate to the superhero, we think that is a net benefit that already wins us this debate in general in the first place to begin with. But why is relatability so important? Why don't you have relatability in their side of the world? We think relatability in general is important because for you to connect with a movie, you need to relate with that movie. What does this mean? What this means that representation is good because it makes you feel secure. It makes you feel heard. It also doesn't mean that you want everything to be shown in the most accurate manner, but just the effort of having the people from your ethnicity being in positions of power, being a superhero. We think that in general creates relatability because you understand that it's fiction. You don't need for everything to be shown accurately. You just want people from your community to be represented within it, and that is something that's really important for you in the first place to begin with. But secondarily, why is escapism important? I've already highlighted this. This is the most important impact within this debate because minorities' proximate experiences are bad. Their lived experiences are bad. They suffer in poverty and they have discrimination that they also face. Insofar as that is true, the most important thing within this debate is where they feel more hope, where they feel more escapism. In their side of the world, when they don't have relatability with these movies, they don't get escape, they don't get hope. And that's the worst form of impact that you can have because it's the most important impact within this debate in the first place to begin with. Let's start weighing this on 4 metrics. Firstly, in terms of urgency. We think prioritizing escapism and hope for minorities is more important because of the environments that they come from. But secondarily, it's also intense in nature. Insofar as you feel more secure in your identity, you feel more happy, that's an intense harm because you fundamentally start feeling better. If you feel better, you are able to translate it into other aspects of your life, and that's also important. But why is hope so important, and why is hope the winning point within this debate? Firstly, it's scalable to everyone. Hope doesn't differentiate among people. Hope is not discriminatory in nature. It's scalable to every single person who's watching that movie. It's a universal experience. Insofar as we increase the amount of people who are able to access that hope, that on scale means more people are hopeful in general. But secondarily, and this is more important, hope is not contingent on practical outcomes. If I'm a minority person and I get hope, that's not dependent on my life circumstances getting better because it's realistically true. If I'm from a minority community, probably I'm poor, I don't have financial safety, etc. That also means that it's tough for me to get a job. It's tough for me to improve my life. But hope is not dependent on that. Hope is not dependent on your current and your future circumstances. Why is this the most important thing? This is the most important thing because this proves that even if minorities are suffering, on a certainty metric, they at least feel better in our side of the world because if they cannot improve their life, they can just feel better about their life, and that's the most certain impact that you can have. They are very speculative, very probable.
Starting reply 3, 2, 1. What's the best version of the counterfact we get in this debate? This is this. They say these movies will probably crowd out the important documentaries, etc. I think that's the best form of the counterfact which we probably get in the third speech clearly. What's the problem in the premise of this argument? Note the first affirmative speech because they characterize to you that right now documentaries are on the rise in terms of getting popularity, getting Oscars, etc. Just gut check that. That's status quo. That's exactly what we're defending. What this just gives you an intuition about is that regardless of major scalable movies and entertainment being made, there is also rising popularity of documentaries because just for the art form they're having, just because of the technicality in them, the accuracy in them, etc. Which means they are able to gain popularity while the existence of all these movies. This just tells you, according to their own framing, the probability of this crowding of happening at the greatest degree is anyways very, very minimal because of the few reasons they give you. One is there are different audiences for both types of entertainment. People who want to go and see the skills in documentaries and the direction of documentaries, etc., will probably still go and vote in Oscars, be a part of juries who talk about this, make video breakdown on YouTube, etc. But people who want to watch Marvel probably going to do that regardless. Which means the audiences are so different, it proves to you that probably the popularity is not interconnected at any point in time. But secondly, we take the worst case possible. Dhruv ways to you, even if this crowding would happen, which is not happening in status quo in the retrospective debate, even if that's the truth, I think it reflects the nature of what the current need is. If the audiences demand those sort of movies and they do get net benefits from it, they have no analysis to prove why the net benefit is actually not there or a competing analysis to prove to you why that won't exist. Without that, they never engage with the best case analysis on our side. What's the second best thing they have? They say you make it in the bad way and lead to appropriation. I want to gut check one thing, and this might sound counterintuitive. What is the problem with appropriation, they tell you? Because note that their impact stops at appropriation exists. But what happens with that? Like, do I as an individual feel bad because you showed my customs differently? This is where analysis is very important. We say the mindset that I enter the theater is that, you know what, I want to watch a person from my background thrash the villain in this movie. That's what I want to see. Which means that when I enter this sort of movie, I am not having an expectation. I want to watch where my culture came from. My father's told me enough about that. I want to see a bad guy being thrown up by a person from my community. Which is where, just note, appropriation has no end impact being proven by them. Because they never explain what these people want. And also this, right? Do these people want to see the struggles they've been a part of on the big screen? Like, imagine this, your father's told you about the struggles. Like, my father's told me about the Sikh struggle during the 47 independence. Do I want to continue reliving those traumas on the bigger screen? Probably not. Which is where our point comes in. They have to answer the prerequisite is, what do these people want to watch? We say if these struggles exist and the problems that existed in the past, probably this sort of hope and like this disformed reality of superheroes is a good form of entertainment for me. But secondly, you might ask, what's the point of that in our world? This is where analysis is crucial. We say the points of references in these movies makes you feel more secure about your identity, which is the problem in status quo. Because you feel so away from the mainstream, you feel like you can never be a part of that mainstream. But when you act as like have points of references in these mainstream characters, you in social circles can talk about this. You can have a voice on social media when you talk about these movies representing your ideology. These points of references give confidence to these individuals, and we have the prerequisite analysis to explain why this is important in this debate, because this is what's lacking in these individuals. But in the comparative, even in the reply, if they come and explain to you why appropriation will happen, they can't add material about explaining why that's relevant in the debate, which they've missed throughout this debate. But lastly, they say representation is never going to be absolute because you're probably going to have different sort of movies, etc. But note this, right? If you have movies being made right now in status quo, you don't regret their existence, you'll probably have more and more movies being made about diverse issues. Probably you will have more and more communities being represented. But the comparative looks like you're making it stop right now, which means the possibility of showing diversity in the future probably is minimal at best. Which means one, on showcasing diverse actors in these movies because they didn't have to play those characters and acting as points of references. But second, these people be feeling good in this catharsis. But thirdly, in terms of saying why we co-opt their counterfacts in the existence of the documentaries, A, they don't have a comparative, but B, their best case in the comparative is unlikely and unproven. Dhruv's way proves that we do. Very proud to take this one on it.
Affirmative team talked about how people of these minority communities are vulnerable, and that's why we need to provide hope and escapism through the form of mainstream fantasy movies that represent their culture. And then they support the perpetuation of movies that inherently distort people. And they say cultural appropriation is okay. What is the problem with it? I'm going to explain to you what's the reason with it. Firstly, they talk about exposure and how having these cultural characters represented in these movies will make these people feel hope. We tell you that literally read the motion. This motion is about using language and culture in fantasy and sci-fi movies, meaning that on our side, yes, we have different ethnic actors with different races representing different characters in other mainstream media, because sci-fi and fantasy is not the only kind of movies that exist in the current world. We have realist movies, we have humanist movies, we have dystopian movies. These are all diverse genres in which that minority characters can be represented. But even if they don't buy that, we think that any kind of representation and a form of empowerment can exist in other forms, like having more minorities in literally politics, or having more people talking about these minority issues on the news or through investigative journalism. So if their end impact is empowerment, there are thousands of different ways in which we can do so. And then they talk about how entry, when you're going into a fantasy movie, there is an expectation that it is fictional, and that's why it's okay to culturally appropriate. We tell you that is the exact line of logic that these companies and these media producers use to justify the kind of distortion that they put upon culture. And that is why it is unacceptable. Thirdly, they talk about, okay, what's wrong with cultural appropriation? Why is that bad? We tell you the reason why cultural appropriation is bad is because it is inherently not a representation of your culture. told you for numerous reasons. Firstly, the idea of the fact that the world building a different world means that often different cultures are involved in forming that same world, meaning that there's no representation, but a disproportion of diverse cultures in forming this one avatar fantasy world. Secondly, we told you that these people inherently have lower screen time, meaning the kind of narratives or the kind of words in which they speak in their native Swahili language is also very limited, meaning that those get a lot of media attention. It's a lot Eurocentric, and it is advertised in a way that is foreign and is different as opposed to accepting in our society. We told you that cultural appropriation is also bad, so inherently, the idea of distortion, the idea of difference, which is far more likely in fantasy worlds where they're world building, is a problem, because then you don't get an actual cultural representation of your culture, but something else that is using your culture as a tool. Secondly, this is also bad because culture and language is an identity that you identify with. At the point in which that is distorted, but it is advertised in a way that represents your culture, it is misrepresenting who you are. This is especially bad because we told you there's a power asymmetry that exists in which these minorities often cannot speak out against large companies. We also told you about the crowding out effect. They mentioned social media and how social media is going to discourse these issues. Yeah, we think that is the exact reason why when we have more people watching these fantasy movies because they're mainstream and thinking that this represents these culture, that means we have more crowding out on actual real people who watch things like documentaries talking about real culture. These people now belong in the minority of the discourse, meaning the large, not only is the movie crowded out, but the discourse around whether this is representative or not is also crowded out, right? That is the problem why cultural appropriation is bad. I am literally, utterly shocked that I have to explain why cultural appropriation is bad in this debate. Finally, let's talk about why crowding out happens. First of all, it's either you don't really know, you watch Avatar, or you watch Wakanda, you don't really know that they represent a certain tribal culture, or you go into it thinking that it does represent a certain culture, but essentially, if you how many movies can you possibly watch in your lifetime, right? Unless you're interested in that culture itself, you're probably not going to absolutely go over it, meaning that the minor amount of movies that you actually watch significantly affect the kind of narrative you have around these people, meaning that the kind of movies that you watch should be most accurate as possible, and we get more of that under ours, and we have less crowding out of representation of these cultures, proving the kind of thing for more people realistic around the movies. For this reason, it's
Hi everyone, thank you all very much for that debate. I enjoy movies, so I enjoy some of the movie references in today's debate. What we'll do is we'll do general feedback, result, reasons for the result. Let's do general feedback. There's actually a lot more of those movie references. I think there's things like Dune, I believe is probably the inspiration behind this topic, given its popularity. It's come out recently and is heavily based on Islamic or Arabic culture. There's a heap of stuff. I think some of the examples around Black Panther are probably a good one in this debate as well, and also Avatar. I want a bit more explanation of those things, a bit more linking in as to how I think we achieve those outcomes in the debate. I think the same thing in general feedback is just more of a note about regrets debates and how they work. I think this is a problem that exists kind of for both teams, is that AF has a counterfactual they think would happen instead of what they would like to happen instead. I think AF needs to do more work to explain why your vision of the alternative would be likely to occur, because you don't have the power to say it will be this way, so more about why it will occur that way. And similarly from Neg, I think you guys can push more about why that won't occur, but also push a different vision of what you think that counterfactual will be. So your counterfactual won't exist for these reasons, but the actual counterfactual would be absent this thing happening is this for these reasons. So both teams can have a conception of that. And that's, I think, a good thing to think about when approaching regrets or support debates is they go one of two ways, basically. Do you both agree on what the counterfactual is and you just argue about which world is better? Or do you disagree about the counterfactual, which means the debate is actually which counterfactual is true and then who wins in each of those counterfactuals. So thinking about that in prep can help you, I guess, more strategically think about where the case is going to go. The other thing, building off that with the counterfactual, a bit more about the why, but I want also, in other parts of the debate as well, a lot of claims are made about directors bringing in or not bringing in expertise and advice from people in those cultural groups. I want more about the why that would actually happen and why that's likely to be the case. The last piece of general feedback, I think, no, I'll just give the result, then I'll give this piece of feedback. So in terms of the result then, we had a unanimous decision and we all agreed toward the debate to side affirmative. Congratulations. The actual general feedback I wanted to give would have just given away the results, so I think I'd do it after the result. And that is just to say, I think at times the neg case drifts further and further away from the motion, the more we're talking about, I guess, representation or vision. And I'll come to that in more detail in the actual deliberation. I think drifts away from the debate, which is about the co-option of language, culture, etc. of those groups in those movies, which means I think at times the thing that Neg is defending isn't necessarily under threat. So I think from Neg, making that connection clearer, from AF, making that disconnect clearer as to why it's not part of the debate. All right, let's actually go through the full decision now. I think there are broadly 3 issues in the debate. I firstly want to look at whether or not this is likely to be done well. When I say done well, we're talking here about the co-option of culture and language, etc., into sci-fi and fantasy. So we have a few things from AF as to why it's not likely to be done well. The first one being the majority of these big budget things we're talking about are likely to, because they are big budget and require big funding, are likely to be American or European, like Western centric basically, which has a few flow-ons then into like requiring like English as a primary language and a lack of, like, I guess, expertise or care or consideration for the other cultures. I think what that also bleeds into then is a way in which it's presented. So they use the different language as an otherization tool, so give it to villains or to not the main characters, or it's used in a way that's like they speak their native tongue in like the worst examples, like I'm going to kill you now, I think was the example that was given in the speech and things like that, which I think all ultimately presents kind of a few structural reasons as to why this is likely to happen in a way that is done badly. I would note on a piece of feedback that, like, in something like Dune, aside from the poor tradition is kind of good, kind of bad, the good guys are the one based off Islam, but again, not raised in the debate, but maybe I just watched too much Dune. Anyway, back on the actual debate. But again, that is unfortunately not a response given from Neg to sort of challenge the example basis of the debate to say, well, no, actually it's done in a positive sense. So I can't credit that as just external knowledge. What I think they also do well from AF is go even if. So even if it is done well, there's an issue of, one, people don't know that this is the culture, they're seeing it, but they're not understanding it and taking that message on board, which means there's no benefit necessarily to it happening, but also opportunity cost. I think the first even if is kind of like true, there's probably not a whole lot of response there either from AF that like people might not know. Not necessarily sure that leads to a significant harm if it is done well and people just don't realise, so I don't think it gets a whole lot of credit as to like a positive defence from AF. I think on the opportunity cost, I think Neg does a good job here of showing why the different audiences probably means the opportunity cost doesn't actually play out. So I don't think the material from AF that the directors and actors will go elsewhere stands true, nor do I think that the audiences who are watching sci-fi will necessarily want to go and watch a different film instead. So I think Neg gets credit for those reasons on the even if part, but on the done well part specifically, Neg gives the next set of responses. That is to say, what we hear at first, that there's a profit incentive. So you want positive reviews, you want interviews, you want to brag about how diverse your cast is, so therefore you have incentives to get good directors in, get good consultants in, etc. I think the question here is a question of the audience, and the only sort of reason we get is the audiences are becoming more liberal and more progressive and they want more diversity. I think this just doesn't get much beyond an assertion that audiences necessarily want this, and there's a big question here about do the audiences actually care that much. And I think Neg does, I think AF does enough to sort of say they probably don't in a lot of these cases, because they're not, like, while they're made for majority Western audience, they feel like the service is being done. They don't necessarily want to backlash or fight against this and complain as well. I think Negative has some stuff here around why this would then lead to more diverse hiring, representation, and that sort of thing within the film. So, like, I think the clash around like Shang-Chi versus just another white Superman being bad. I think the problem here is that maybe the backlash works in that sense to try and get diversity on the screen, but I'm not sure it necessarily works to stop the co-option of this sort of stuff we're talking about from AF, which is more about where the audiences are. So I guess on the question of do these audiences care, and we think that AF does enough to suggest probably not going to be a significant amount of care to make these Western film studios make these things be done particularly well. I think the other things that they get from AF are that, like, the political power of these minority groups is limited to actually backlash or to complain. So the groups that are most affected don't have the capital or size to do the backlashing. It is reliant on a bigger group that unfortunately is not activated in this debate. But also I think they point out that in large cases you can avoid this backlash by calling it fiction. So even if there are people that are angry about this or disappointed in this, because it's fictionalized, it's sci-fi, it's different, there's not necessarily going to be a connection between that being the cultural option overall. So I think at this point then, it is not likely to be done particularly well, and AF takes this issue. There is a claim that comes up, I guess, in the next couple of issues around whether or not, like, it matters that it is done well. I guess sort of this in-between claim here, it doesn't matter if it's done well, because people aren't expecting it to be done well, they're not expecting private representation, just want to go and see somebody. Again, there's an issue there of disconnect from the debate a little bit, but I think that there is some good material given right from first AF, and whipped again later, particularly in reply, around why cultural appropriation and things being done well does matter. It's an incorrect, it's a wrong perception of religion, it creates norms of otherization, it makes those groups feel worse about their connection with society. So I do think there is a harm that is generated from AF, people within that group and representation of people within that group. with that little half issue out of the way, let's then flip that and compare to the counterfactual for a second. I think I've given a bit of previewing of how this has gone in the opening part of the OA. We don't believe Affirmative can claim it's counterfactual in today's debate, and we do think Neg does take this issue in the debate of proving why AF's counterfactual can't actually occur. So that being that like you get better films. I don't think you necessarily claim documentaries as Neg characterises it later on, but things films like Parasite, etc. So a couple of responses from Neg. I think the first one is to point out that is the status quo. AF's talking about the films they like. They can claim them too. We agree with that. They do get to claim those films. I think they also do enough to suggest that there's enough disconnect between like audiences and directors and actors, etc., that mean we won't necessarily see a push towards the better films we're talking about as a replacement for these films. So I don't think those are likely to occur either. I think we need a lot more of why from AF you actually get these things as the clear replacement, why there be incentives or structures in place. Because it's also, I think, particularly in tension with the material earlier given about why Hollywood is so like nonchalant, not caring about representing accurately, that all of a sudden, in the absence of doing a poor representation of this, they would immediately turn to doing a good representation of this, if those things stayed constant as to why they did the poor representation in the first place. So I don't necessarily think that they can claim that counterfactual as being successful. One thing that ultimately does to the debate then is AF doesn't have a whole lot of like positive flip side, which I guess we're kind of then comparing whether or not this is better than nothing at all, which again, to put feedback hat on for a second, would have just been a stronger critique take from AF to be of just like, yep, there will be less, but there'll be less bad and that's okay. But again, not part of the debate, so I think it comes up. Strategic feedback I think would be useful there. So anyways, I don't think the counterfactual happens then. The last thing I note about the counterfactual is that when Neg gives the response at third, that like, well, even if that is the counterfactual, it's bad. These communities know that their lives are not good. They know the structures and the pressures that exist in the world. They want escapism, etc. They don't need realism. I think that's probably true as well. So I think it's probably a true claim to make that like we don't necessarily want these films, but that relies on there being a well done, good characterization of these films and these cultures in existence otherwise, which I don't think they get either. So like a fair observation to make about what those audiences want, but I don't think there's a whole lot of shit to cut the issue anymore. So Neg does take issue on why the counterfactual doesn't work, but is still behind on the issue whether or not this is done well. Let's then compare that to the benefits of exposure, representation, etc. that Neg talks about to see if they outweigh the harms we've got from the first issue of it being done badly. This is, I guess, contingent. I guess, unfortunately, this issue is a bit contingent on the quality of whether it is done well, because if it is done badly, I think AF, as pointed out, has got some harms to that being done badly. So the first sort of benefit we get from the first negative is is the only cultural touchpoint exposure that people get. We get the example like video gamers playing games. They're not going to see another culture outside of the game. 4,000 hours of gaming, episodes of TV, etc. I think that's probably true to some extent. This might be the only exposure these some of these individuals get, but exposure in and of itself we didn't think was a benefit, like a good claim to like a strong benefit, if that exposure was, AF has already won the issue, bad, and we didn't think why that necessarily would be a good level of exposure for these individuals to get that would somehow make a massive improvement. We think the case then shifts a bit more at second and third negative to being around representations, about the idea of seeing oneself on cinema. And we would credit here that the analysis about representation and seeing your culture, people who look like you and act like you, being on screen in positions of power and as heroes is quite powerful, really well made, and I think moving to listen to at points. I guess the question we had here was, we just didn't think it was connected enough to the debate, because the debate is not necessarily about diversity on screen or having different representations of people in those roles. The debate is about those cooptions, those cultures, etc. So we're willing to believe the response we get at AF reply and third AF that say that we can still have those cultures and diversity. It's about whether or not we want to take that whole culture, co-opt it, use their language, etc., and act in a bad way. So we don't necessarily think that comes through on those issues. So I think at that point then it's harder to credit this issue as being enough to get AF over as to why why that alone is going to be good, because we believe it still exists outside of what is being regretted in this debate. I think ultimately what that ends up being then is like, while it's not explicit from AF, the way the debate's forward is the implicit claim that it's still better to have none of this than the bad stuff we get, ultimately ends up becoming the trade-off that the panel makes, that it is better that we didn't didn't have this co-option, because the exposure benefit or representation benefit is not unique. There is no particular benefit to cultural exposure understanding from this, and it is likely to be done quite badly. So even if the comparative falls and app doesn't get the good comparative, it is still a bad outcome, and that's what happens in the debate. I hope that all made sense. Thank you very much for the debate, and best of luck for the rest of the Australs.